It's indeed a great pleasure to be here, to be connected with Astha after a very, very long time. I was associated with it at the time of its inception, and now it feels very good to be back here. And since this is something that we are remembering Pulin, I chose to pick on this theme. There are several facets to it. First is my own relationship with Pulin was very ambivalent. He certainly is someone who has influenced my thinking a great deal. He's impacted me a lot, both as a person and in terms of, if I may call it, my perspective on life, my perspective about human relationships, a whole lot of things. And yet, our interfaces were always full of contention and challenge. Some of you have been witness to that. He used to call me the doubting Thomas. So that was the kind of relationship that we had. I also believe that the theme of existential ambivalence was very central to Pulin's work. Some of it articulated, some of it not so clearly articulated. But almost many of his insights, works, brilliant pieces, in my mind, get connected with the theme of existential ambivalence. Thirdly, I think he was very ambivalent about ambivalence itself. So at one hand, he regarded ambivalence as a very core theme of Indian identity. It was one of the core themes he thought of the Indian identity. And yet he didn't know how to treat, he gave various messages around what it means. And I think part of it, my own hunch is, that there was perhaps a conflict between Pulin, the quintessential Indian, and Pulin, the clinical psychologist. The clinical psychologist in Pulin pushed him to look at ambivalence in a certain way. The quintessential Indian, which Pulin was, made him look at ambivalence in perhaps somewhat different way. Let me put all that aside and come to what existential ambivalence is all about. Where does it stem from? And how does it impact? There's a lot of evidence to believe that all species feel, think. But ambivalence, I'm not too sure. Because ambivalence is rooted in something which, by the evidence of it, is right now uniquely human, is self-reflexivity. While there is evidence that other species may feel and think, but are they self-reflexive? We don't know. What differentiates perhaps human beings is that we don't just feel and think and act. We feel and think about the way we feel and think. And this is a central difference. So you may feel jealous, and you may feel guilty about feeling jealous. Or you may ask yourself, why am I feeling like this? Why am I upset? What is making me angry? Why am I behaving the way? So this thing of turning the gaze inwards and thinking about. So while feeling and thinking, like if we were not self-reflexive, perhaps we will not feel ambivalent. We would feel, act, think, and act. There will be no question, there will be no doubt, there will be no, things will not raise their head. If I again quote Pulin on this, because Pulin said that ambivalence arises from the fact that human beings are both physiological entities and psychological entities. He did not quite elaborate as to what he meant by it. But my hunch is that what he was really saying is that since human beings are self-reflexive and not just driven by instinct alone, that is where ambivalence comes into play. So the source of ambivalence in some ways is self-reflexivity. If there is self-reflexivity, there will be ambivalence. And ambivalence to that extent is evidence of our essential humanness, of our self-reflexivity. So what does it have to do with identity? Where does it figure in? Let's first look at what is identity and what are the ways in which we ask yourself the question, who am I? And note down for yourself on a piece of paper or in your mind the kind of responses which come to you. Now, if you look at the kind of things which have come to your mind, they would broadly fall into two buckets. One bucket would be of elements which are in the nature of personal attributes, personal qualities, personal wishes, personal desires. So did we have elements like I'm strong, I'm intelligent, I'm capable, I'm things of that kind which describe you as an individual. The second bucket would be of elements which talk about essentially your belonging systems. There would be elements like I'm an Indian, I'm a Bengali, I'm come from this kind of family, I come from this kind of an institution. So where do I come from? Where do I belong? Classically, the first is what we say when we use the term identity, we use it in two ways. One, what the individual is identified by. What are the signature of that individual? What are the specifics of that individual? What is the individual identified by? The second is what does the individual identify with? Who does this individual identify with? So identity has both aspects. In some ways, it can be said this is one meaning of identity is around your distinctiveness, your separateness. The other meaning of identity is your connectedness. What are you connected with? If I link it with what Gautamji was saying, the world is in me and I'm in the world. So there is a distinctiveness, me as a separate autonomous being, and me as a part of something larger than it. In many ways, this is what Herbert Mead regarded as the essential core of existential ambivalence. that the ambivalence arises from this fact that human beings are both autonomous and they are relational. So what he called the me orientation and the I orientation. The I orientation is the I as an autonomous separate entity, me as a relational being, as a being who's connected with all other beings. In a very similar was the term used by Kotzler, what he called holon. The holon simply means something which is part and whole at the same time. It is whole in itself, and it is also part of a larger whole. In a sense, everything in this universe is a holon. So this notion of parthood and wholeness, this is one way in which one can look at existential ambivalence. This tension between parthood and wholeness. I'm going to take a detour here before I come back to this theme and take you to a framework which is essentially developed, has been developed on this premise of the tension between parthood and wholeness. This oscillation, this simultaneity of being part and whole is what is the essential building block of the framework that we are going to talk about, which is EUM, Existential Universe Mapper. You can see it's essentially a framework for understanding individuals, organizations or collectives and the relatedness between them. Right? Can we move on? The framework has been inspired by the work of a person called Graves, Clare Graves, on his theory of levels of existence, which has very close parallels also with Sri Aurobindo's theory and Maslow's hierarchy of needs in different ways. And then you will see that there are the other source of inspiration is what we have called strong resonance with Indian approaches like pluralism, non-linearity, holism, context sensitivity. If I was to put one word to it, I would call it Pullingarg. So in a sense, Hume is a marriage of Graves with Pullingarg. Because all these, while they are not uniquely, they can't be said this is Pullingarg, but this has been in some ways the essence of influence, Pullin's influence on my thinking. It is this thing in terms of plurality, holism, emphasis of context, pattern recognition. These are the kinds of things moving away from the linear ways of looking at things. Because in many ways, Graves' work still remained in the classical linear logic frame. For instance, and I would elaborate in terms of how the differences became if once we go into the little bit about the framework. Essentially, the framework posits 6 universes which reside within each individual. Each universe is a composite system of needs, attitudes, behaviors, values, etc. They are evolutionary but not hierarchical. The universes are in constant interaction with each other. And here is where the major difference from Graves takes place. In Graves' frame, these universes are regarded as steady states, where one moves from one state to another state. Somewhat similar to Maslowian hierarchy of needs, right? One level, this level, this level, this level, etc. In Hume, they are not regarded, and that's where the Gargian influence comes, are not regarded as steady states. They are regarded as fluid, dynamic configurations, and these are in constant interaction with each other. A simple way of slightly oversimplified ways is that in Hume you look at an individual as a ongoing living psychodrama. And there are 6 characters. In fact, there are infinite characters, but here you have to put in a framework. So you take these 6 characters who are all the time engaging with each other, dialoguing with each other, finding some way, conflicting with each other. Sometimes they create music, sometimes they create noise. So it's not there is no steady state here. It's a constant interactive, constantly moving thing in terms of, and we look at identity itself as a dynamic configuration of various elements. So the elements are the same across all human beings, but how they configure with it makes a difference. From the point of view of understanding identity, we will focus only on the first 2. I'm not going to take you through all the 6. Because the first 2 are which we regard as central to identity. From identity point of view formation, the first 2 are the, move on please. These are the 6. Universe of belonging and protection, strength and desire, roles and boundaries, purpose and achievement, meaningfulness and intimacy, duality and simultaneity. But for our purpose, for the purpose of our discussion, the relevant universes are the first and the second. So let's see what these are. The universe of belonging and protection is that part of us which seeks a safe haven, which seeks a home, which wishes to put down roots, which wishes to preserve, which wishes to continue with the way things are, which is the one which, again, sir, in your understanding of the history that you were talking about, which says, don't go against history. If you are going to fight it, it's bound to be a exercise in futility. So it builds on continuity in terms of going on again and again with the thing which is. So these are some of the main features of this universe, which is talking essentially about the relational orientation. This is the universe which is telling you that you are a part of something larger. The second universe, on the other hand, which is what we call universe of strength and desire, is the universe which is, I'm somebody. I'm the center of this universe. The world exists because I exist. I have my needs, I have my desires, and it is through my own strength, my own prowess, that I would try and achieve that. You remember that famous couplet of Iqbal? खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रज़ा क्या है. Make yourself strong, powerful, so that you can achieve what you need to achieve, your agency, your volition, it is you. So here the emphasis is primarily on you as whole and complete in yourself, as an autonomous being. What Mead will call the I orientation, whereas the first is what Mead will call the me orientation. What Kotzler here will call, I'm the whole, the other one, that I'm only a part. The first level of ambivalence arises from the tension between these two. The tension between the relational orientation and the autonomous orientation. The tension, what we call between UBP and USD, the universe of belonging and protection and the universe of strength and desire. That's the first level of ambivalence. Per picture abhi baki hai. The story is not complete here. The interesting part is that these universes within themselves create tensions, contain tensions. They have their inherent conflicting pulls. This is not inter-universe. This is within that universe. So if you look at UBP, the universe of belonging and protection, the safe haven is not just a safe haven. It is also a prison. It also restricts you. It prevents you from looking at your identification with. The context becomes so strong that you are unable to see the negative sides of the context, because the context will generate both positive feelings in you and negative feelings in you. You will identify with the context, you will feel comfortable in the context, and the context will also make you restless. So I'd like you to do something for yourself. Ask yourself that in your own context, right? If you were, how much this context makes you feel happy, safe, have a sense of belonging, you identify with, and how much of it makes you uneasy. Like, you can take anything. For instance, you can take the context of a nation. How do you feel about being Indian? And you may well find that you feel ambivalent about it. Some parts of being an Indian seem very nice, attractive, hold you. Some parts do not. How do you feel about belonging to an organization, to this work system, or your family, or etc.? Take any system and ask yourself. Obviously, we all oscillate. Part of me tells me, oh, this is my home, this is where I belong, this is so nice, these are my people, these are the people I feel good with, these are the people who care for me. Part of me says, this is not my context. This is not something I feel good about. I can't identify with this. There are so many, issues over here. There are so many inequalities, injustices, unfairness, all kinds of things. So, as a very broad kind of thing, ask yourself as to, in this pendulum, this constant oscillation, and we call this the oscillation of I belong, I do not belong. Part of me keeps telling me I belong. This is my home. And part of me keeps saying, this is not my home. I don't belong. So ask yourself that where is your leaning? Obviously, I'm putting it in a very simple kind of thing. Do I lean more towards I belong? Or do I lean more towards I do not belong? Similarly, the other universe, what we call the universe of strength and desire, part of me says, I'm the center of the world exists because I exist, I must continuously take responsibility, act, exercise my choice. This part of me also says, what is this myth about choice? Do I really have a choice? Do I really exercise choice? Or is there something which keeps happening? Rather than insisting on having control, mastery over my destiny, wouldn't I be better off if I could just surrender myself to the way things are, to flow with it, to feel tranquil, to feel. Why am I so caught up with my own needs, my own desires? Why can't I transcend all this? So there is a part of me which keeps pulling me in saying, I matter. I'm the other part which keeps telling me, I don't really matter. If I surrender, if I let go, if I flow with the way things are, that's the way to be. This insistence on having things my own way, or what you would broadly call being egoistical. So some part of me strengthens my ego, or enables me to stand on my own feet, gives me a sense of volition, responsibility, and there's some part of me which says, I don't really matter. So if you have seen, we have actually created four broad clusters. The first cluster is of people who say, I matter and I belong. In Hume terms, these are people who have a high degree of comfort with both universes, with both the universe of belonging and protection and universe of strength and desire. The second cluster is of I matter, but I don't belong. I don't embrace my context. I feel uneasy with my context. Then we have the third cluster, I don't matter, but I belong. And we have the fourth cluster, I neither matter nor do I belong. Now, if I put it in the Gargian frame, I don't know how many of you remember this, recall this, but Pulin used to talk about four essential archetypes of identity: the captive, the rebel, the orphan, and the wanderer. Do you remember that? No? These were often used archetypal identities that he talked of. The second, the rebel. You see the third as the orphan. I matter, I don't matter, but this system is the system where I am, this is the one which is. And the wanderer, I neither matter nor do I belong. And if I go one further thing, many of you are familiar with the Four Princes story. Yeah? Now, Pulin didn't directly make the link between these four and that four, but I think there is a link. The first prince is the essential captive identity. The second prince is essentially the rebel, the warrior prince. The first is the scholar prince, for those of you who may not be familiar with the stories. It's I personally think that was Pulin's greatest, most creative work, where he, captured it so beautifully in terms of the various things of. There is a difference because those are more role identities, and the captives, etc., are more what one would call uh, personal identities, but there self-identities. But there is a link between these. The third, the healer prince, is also the orphan or the martyr. And the fourth, the joker prince, the clown prince, is also the wanderer, the mystic, the uh, you know one who doesn't put roots very easily, right? And who's all the time seeking and searching. I think in the paper I have elaborated on some of this a little more. So while this is not intended to kind of box anyone, but to provide a certain broad framework to understand the interplay of identities that the individual holds and how the engagement with existential ambivalence plays out very, very significantly. We have many times when we have done this as an exercise, we often do it as an exercise of creating and then inviting people. And if we have also done the four principles, we find a very strong correlation between this and that. Because primarily it's the how one is engaging with. This is, of course, an oversimplified thing of putting it. But the essential issues of existential ambivalence are, in a to a very large extent, influence, impact the kind of identity that is likely to emerge. I would repeat again one of my favorite ones from Pulin. I'm this, I'm that, and I'm more. This is one of his greatest gifts, I think, which he gave to many of us. All right, we are. Thank you.